Hello and welcome to Choice Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Stefanick. Co-hosting with me today is the esteemed Steve Patterson. Steve, welcome back.
Esteemed Steve, that's great. I love it. Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction.
All right, today we're going to be talking with Alfie Kohn. He is a lecturer and author covering the topics parenting, education, and human behavior. His work includes the best-selling books Punished by Rewards, The Trouble with Gold Stars, and Unconditional Parenting, Moving from Rewards and Punishments to Love and Reason, and several other great works. Alfie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, so why don't you tell us about your journey to this point in your life where, now you're an author and a lecturer discussing parenting and education?
Well, the first book that I wrote back in the mid-'80s dealt with the destructive effects of competition in all areas of human life. That book was called No Contest, The Case Against Competition. And it drew from evidence in psychology, economics, biology, anthropology, and many other fields to argue that whenever we have to defeat other people in order to be successful, everyone ultimately is held back from doing his or her best and flourishing psychologically. And after I wrote that book, it led me to a number of other interesting areas, interesting to me at least. One was to look at the claim that competition is just part of human nature, which led me to ask about other things we attribute to just human nature, which are almost always negative, like being selfish or aggressive. And I wrote a book called The Brighter Side of Human Nature, which looked at altruism and empathy, which are, in fact, important parts of what it means to be human. And it also led me to ask about different kinds of motivation. For example, if trying to beat people ends up being counterproductive, is it possible that just getting a reward for succeeding, even if it's not at someone else's expense? For example, take a classroom where at least we've moved away from grading on a curve, but we're still giving out grades, and students are thinking in terms of whether they'll get an A. Is that destructive? And that led to the book you mentioned, Punished by Rewards, which draws from a lot of evidence to suggest that carrots are as bad as sticks, which is to say that when you say to people, do this and you'll get that, that turns out to make people less successful. And I looked at how that plays out in the family, in education, and in the workplace. I wrote a bunch of other books, including a number about education, but the other book you mentioned, and the one I think you're more interested in today, is one I did in 2005 called Unconditional Parenting, which is where, as the title suggests, I focus on the family and look at various issues having to do with what it means to work with kids to help them become good people, as opposed to doing things to kids to make them do what we tell them.
Right. The thing I liked about your book, Unconditional Parenting, is there was just so much evidence within all these studies. I'd been kind of exposed to some of these ideas of not being judgmental, which is basically what rewards and punishments are, is you're judging things as either being good or bad. And even if you're judging it as being good, you're still being judgmental.
Right.
I'd been exposed to that in the works of Marshall Rosenberg. He does nonviolent communication, and some other authors.
Right, yes.
But I had not seen all this evidence that why you should do that. In your book, there's just one study after another,
right,
showing, and just basically every way you could think of to measure, is this a good thing?
Yeah. It
really supported the case. And it was interesting because a lot of these studies were done by people who were expecting different results. Perhaps they were authoritarian, and they were measuring authoritarian parenting versus more negotiation and the like. And they expected the children that were raised with authoritarian styles to be the ones that were better behaved when the parents weren't there, for example. And they were shocked when they found out, geez, that's not the case. So, because, you can run into that issue in science where there's kind of confirmation bias and seeing what you want to see. But there was several examples where they didn't see what they wanted to see,
right,
and it supported the case.
Whenever you see the phrase contrary to hypothesis,
right,
in a study, it's time to wake up. I think the more common experience on the part of researchers, or at least it was the case in the early days of doing this kind of investigation, was even if we assumed that punishment or an authoritarian approach was destructive, we would expect that rewards would be more conducive to what it is we're looking for, or praise would be, for example, because we're often told, don't punish, reward. Catch kids doing something right and then give them the equivalent of a doggy biscuit for it. But it turns out that rewards, including verbal rewards, like good job, are not really fundamentally different from punishment. They're the two sides of the same coin, and they're both ways of trying to get what amounts to mindless obedience. One of the things I tried to do in unconditional parenting is sort of shift the conversation from just, well, then what technique can I use to get my kid to clean up her room or eat his vegetables or do his homework, and instead to ask about the goals. That is what we're looking to try to get. When I do a workshop for parents, I usually begin by asking, what are your long-term goals for your children? How would you like them to turn out? What do you hope they'll be like even after they've grown up and left? And wherever I go, I get the same adjectives, the same kinds of things that people decide they want. I'd like my kid to be happy, to be ethical, to be caring and compassionate, to be a lifelong learner, to be responsible, successful, responsible, and so on. So then the question becomes, do the traditional ways of using bribes and threats help us to reach our goals? And if not, then we have to rethink. Because most parenting books are not trying to help kids become ethical or happy or caring. They're simply tricks to make kids do whatever the hell you want them to do. And as long as that's the goal, the methods will always be disrespectful and ultimately counterproductive.
Right. What you want the child to develop is intrinsic motivation rather than external motivation. And I've seen this with my own daughter. We had not always discovered these other methods and started off with the behaviorism, the rewards and punishment.
Right.
And what I find is my daughter, she's internalized that. Say if she's working on something that's difficult, say it's a homework problem and she's struggling with it, if she gets it wrong, she punishes herself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, rather than being determined and, okay, I've got to work through this and, rising to the challenge, she kind of just gets frustrated, punishes herself. I'm a bad girl and, I need to go sit in the corner or whatever. It's not certainly what I wanted to see happen.
That's right. And a moment ago, though, you distinguished intrinsic motivation from external, and I might tweak that a bit. On the one hand, we can distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic. Extrinsic means outside of the task itself, but that's not the same as distinguishing between internal and external. Your daughter perhaps has internalized that sense of what I'm supposed to do, and even I'm a bad person if I don't do it or do it well. Her motivation may be internal, but it is not intrinsic. An intrinsically motivated person has a fully integrated, healthy sense of autonomy, of feeling like this is coming from me and it makes sense and I understand why. But lots of parenting and education is about just getting kids to be self-disciplined, to internalize the demands that come from the authority figure. And as a result, you sometimes no longer need to stand over them, threatening them or bribing them, because they've swallowed it whole. But that doesn't mean it's healthy.
Right. I would much rather her desire to work on this, on her homework or whatever, be out of a love of learning and a desire to better herself and being interested in meeting challenges and the like.
Well, you'd rather that she learn because of a love of learning.
Right.
Homework is a whole different question, which I wrote another whole book on, because there's no evidence to support the need for making kids work a second shift when they get home from school, especially before they're in high school. So this is a good example of how parents are saying, what strategy can I use to make my kid do her homework, which she hates? When the correct question is, how can we parents get together and say to the school, our children will be doing other things that we, the family, determine. We will not have them do more schoolwork after spending the whole day in school. So a lot of my work on different issues in school and in workplaces and in families are about asking the bigger questions. Why are we doing this at all? Not how can we do this a little more efficiently? And that's a good example here. But I mean, I'm quibbling or taking our conversation beyond what you may have intended, because I know your main point is you want your child to be excited about learning. And then the question is, how do we move past the usual reward and punishment approach? But in order to make that, I mean, homework helps to destroy kids' desire to figure stuff out. It extinguishes curiosity. The problem is not in your child's head or with your child's motivation. The problem is what we're making kids do. And sometimes we have to be a little more radical and willing to challenge the accepted practices in schools as well as with ourselves as parents, and not just try to tweak our techniques.
Yeah, that's a good point. You talk a lot about progressive education in your work.
Mm-hmm.
And coming at it, the question of how do we educate our children from a completely different angle than how most people today are currently doing it. Why don't you talk about some of the things that you've found?
Okay. Well, just as I mentioned a moment ago that I start with, when I speak to parents, by asking them, what are your long-term goals for your kids? And then we work from there to challenge traditional approaches of raising kids. So I ask teachers, as well as parents, what are your long-term goals for your students? And I get the same kinds of answers. And then I do the same kind of challenge, because basically what I do for a living is to say to people, you say you want this, so how come you're doing that? So if you want kids who are creative and critical thinkers and get a kick out of playing with words and numbers and ideas, and can do it well, then you have to start questioning many aspects of traditional education. Grades, homework, tests, both teacher-given and standardized, many other traditional features of the classroom where the focus is more on cramming forgettable facts into short-term memory or practicing skills out of context, usually just to do well on the next test, all of which fails not only to make schooling joyful and kids excited about learning, but also is not very effective at doing anything except getting some kids to memorize facts for a while. And a lot of kids come out successful graduates by conventional criteria, and they really don't know how to understand ideas from the inside out. They're good at solving math problems using the techniques they were given, but they don't really understand why the techniques work. They haven't really been doing any mathematical thinking, just carrying out algorithms and formulas. And so it is for other things as well, with learning how to write a 5-paragraph essay or memorizing dates in a history class, or definitions in a science class. Progressive education is about helping kids to understand ideas from the inside out, to make connections, and also to be connected with other students so that the learning is going on with one another, not apart, and certainly not against. And it means giving kids more say about their own learning. So I've described this in some other books, and a whole bunch of articles. And by the way, those articles are all available for free on my website, which is just my name, AlfieKohn.org, including an article called simply progressive education.
Yeah, Mr. Kohn, this is Steve here.
Yeah.
What you're talking about right there, having that mechanical student who can do what's told, who can perform the functions of the school system, is different from the kind of children that I think will have a lot of success in the next economy, the upcoming economy, the creative economy. A lot of companies are moving away from this sort of top-down management style. A lot of it's coming out of Silicon Valley. So that's really the reason that me and Chris stumbled upon your work, is because we're sort of moving in that direction. And I think that what you're doing is awesome. And I read your book, Unconditional Parenting, and I fell in love with it. Actually, I think I was drawn to it. Eventually, I was going to discover it, because what you're doing, I think, is correct. But when I read your book, I started to sort of see through the matrix of this sort of conditionality. Everything is on condition. And I noticed that even though I'd read a lot of great books on parenting, I didn't pick up on this one little aspect here of making things on condition. And I started realizing that it's not only the parenting relationship, it's almost everything in life. The immediate supervisor of mine, there's a conditionality there. We do things on condition. I do things on condition to my friends. Yep. But there seems to be a difference there between the parent-child, and maybe you can explain this a little bit more, because for 2 or 3 days, everything was like, okay, is this on a condition? And you just sort of start recognizing this sort of thing. The difference between the conditional relationships that I have with adults and the difference between the conditional relationships that I have with being the parent to the child.
Right.
What is the difference
there? Those are different, yeah. Well, you bring up a number of interesting points there. I'm not arguing that our relationship with adults and with other children are the same or should be treated the same. And that's true in general. For example, if I say, that was a really thoughtful question, I don't have the same concerns about that as I would have praising a child, where there's a lack of symmetry in the relationship between us, a power difference as well. Second, it is very difficult to imagine a truly unconditional relationship with another adult. Maybe with your life partner, it approaches that, but it's still not the same as the way you feel with your child. And it's certainly conditionality is expected in my relationship with other people. If my dry cleaner starts tearing my shirts, I don't feel like the relationship must take precedence. I'll find another dry cleaner. The problem is our tendency to treat our relationships with our kids, and in fact, even with other loved ones, as if they were economic transactions. That's what troubles me, where that conditionality is introduced.
Hey, this is just a quick editor's note. I wanted to clarify the difference between the parent-child relationship and all other relationships. And that would be, it's not voluntary. The child did not voluntarily choose to have their parent. They're stuck with this parent. Now, compare that to the husband-wife relationship. Compare that to the friend-to-friend relationship, or service provider to client. Those are all voluntary. Those are all chosen. And they can be ended just as quickly as they're begun. If I don't like the service I'm getting from a business, I take my money somewhere else. What is a child going to do if they don't like the service they're getting from their parents? They're stuck. That's the long and the short of it. It is because of the involuntary nature of the parent-child relationship that having a conditional approach is not appropriate. If children had an option, then it would be a different story, but they don't. I just thought it was important to make that distinction, so I wanted to insert this in here. All right, we'll get right back to the interview.
And that brings me back to the beginning of what you said, where you were complimenting me, but I'm now going to ungraciously pick it apart, which is to say that now we have an understanding of these issues in education, and we need to move in a different way because of what the economy requires. And I winced, because the educational system will never be more humane and effective as long as we're thinking about schools primarily in terms of preparing future employees. As long as economics, with all of the conditionality and the competition involved in our economic system, is driving the way we teach kids, we are not really going to be doing what's best for the kids themselves in terms of learning. And one of the reasons is that we are focused not only on the kids themselves now, but just as future adults, and in terms of their role in an economic system, but also because our relationship with the kids is profoundly altered for the worse by thinking about it for that reason. I mean, you and I could also discuss whether there really is a substantial change in the way corporations see employees now. I've been hearing this for as long as I've been doing this, for decades, that now we finally have a new age where we want teamwork and creativity and people thinking outside the box, and frankly, I don't buy it. Just because it's more tech doesn't mean we've moved substantially toward a more democratic approach. It's still about seeing employees conditionally. And so I think if we want to value children, we have to stop using economic and corporate models and metaphors and methods, as well as invoking economics as the reason to educate or raise children differently.
I think what Steve was referring to, and I'll let him confirm this in a minute, but was just that in our modern world, the technology is allowing us to automate many jobs that previously somebody who didn't require a lot of thought for someone. Largely, you don't need a secretary anymore with the technology that's available on your laptop, on your PC. You know, a lot of factory jobs are now being automated by robots. So we don't need people that can just sit there and do a brainless task all day long in this factory working on an assembly line.
Right.
Those people are no longer useful. Those people are finding it harder and harder to find jobs. But we can't automate everything. There are areas where we do need creativity. So
yes.
I guess, is that what you were referring to, Steve?
Yeah, actually it was. Basically what I'm looking for is a child that has critical thinking skills of his own. And
right, but we have to value that in order, A, because that's a good thing in itself, and B, because a bunch of people with critical thinking skills can create a more democratic society. Most corporations talk the language about critical thinking, but they don't really want critical thinkers. The kind of employees who could say, why is it that you as the CEO earn 400 times what I earn? You know, or how come your stock price goes up when you throw people out of work? Or how come the power really continues to rest with a small group of managers in here, despite your paying lip service to teamwork? Those real critical thinkers are not valued in the American economy. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't teach kids to be critical thinkers. I think we need to do that. You just don't try to justify it in economic terms, which I think is disingenuous, and also there's better reasons to want that. So, I mean, this may be a relatively minor point compared to the stuff we're really concerned with.
If we raise a generation of critical thinkers, I think that model would be upended.
I think that's an experiment I would love to see us undertake.
Right.
One of the questions that I have is when we're talking about this is, I think it's such a simple question, I'm almost even afraid to ask it. But I think it has a lot of weight here, and that is, what kind of kids can we expect from this method of unconditional parenting where nothing is put on condition? I'd like to say I know the answer, but I'd like to hear how you would answer that. So what are we creating here?
Well, let's be clear about what unconditionality means and doesn't mean, because many traditionalists who are very upset by this idea have turned it into a caricature where it means you let kids do anything they want.
Correct,
that it becomes permissive parenting, where you stand by and let children basically raise themselves, and that is decidedly not the case. Parents have a critical role to play in setting an example, in offering unconditional support, but also guidance and feedback, and many other things. So this is working with parenting, as I describe it, is a lot harder than laissez-faire, doing nothing parenting. It's also harder and more challenging than doing to parenting, where you just tell kids what to do and how you're going to punish or reward them accordingly. So once that's understood, I think kids who are accepted unconditionally are able to accept themselves unconditionally and develop the sense that I can screw up sometimes, I can fall short, but I'm still fundamentally a good person. And that gives people the psychological wherewithal to take more rational risks, to try more things, to reach out, and also, though it may seem paradoxical, to be more caring people who are able to form better relationships with others and be concerned about the needs of others. Kids who have been raised accepted conditionally, where their parents give them lots of love and applause and high fives and hugs and treats only when the kid is impressive or well behaved, learn to accept themselves only conditionally. I'm a good person only when I am doing well in school, when I'm thin, when I'm funny, whatever it is. And that unstable and conditional self-esteem, we know from lots of research, is not conducive to healthy development. So unconditionally accepted kids know their limits and are also less self-centered than kids raised in more traditional households. They're willing to take chances and try things they may not succeed at, and they're also willing to reach out to other people.
That's great stuff. So, Mr. Kohn, I'm going to go ahead and link to your website in the show notes.
Great.
Is there anything you would like to direct the listeners to when they go there? Or?
Oh, no. As long as they can see the website, they're perfectly free to decide what, if anything, they want to explore on the website.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, and Steve, it was nice to have you back on the show.
Oh, it was great. I'm here because of Mr. Kohn. I love the book. I love this conversation. It's funny how, since I've read your book, I see conditionality in other people. Talking to you right now, I realize that a lot of times I use high fives. Of course, it's very difficult to unprogram myself from a lot of the things that are surrounding me, my culture, my upbringing. It was a great time having a conversation with you today, so I appreciate it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you found it personally relevant as well. Thanks so much to both of you for your interest in this.
All right, it's our pleasure.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Take care, Mr. Kohn.
Bye-bye.